Hi, this is John Groders. Join us today on the No Shame podcast as we interview Kevin DeVries from Grace Explorations, a man who has literally climbed the highest mountains and lived to tell about it. The No Shame podcast.
Got no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame of the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid, no shame.
Well, Kevin, thanks for joining us today on the No Shame podcast. I'm excited to meet you. I've read some of your stuff online. I've watched some of the stuff that you've done, and it's crazy. You've done some crazy things.
Yes, I've been called worse, but yes, I've done some crazy things.
So, how did you get to be so crazy? What's your story?
Well, you know, back when I started these journeys, or actually it started all the way back in junior high and probably even earlier than that, my teachers didn't know what to do with me. ADD was something that wasn't on the horizon at that point, and they didn't have the drugs to really medicate kids that were struggling with that. So I not only had that, but I had HD, so I was hyperactive, attention, the whole thing. So my junior high teacher, I had one teacher that actually figured me out. She says, you know what, I'm going to let you run around the school, and when you get tired, you come back to class, but don't come back in until you're tired because you're disruptive and you're just banging books against your head and you're climbing the walls and you're sticking forks in electrical sockets. So I was just full-blown off the map, you know, just very, very low attention span. And so I think God just got a hold of me, and I became an entrepreneur, which a lot of entrepreneurs are that type. You know, they're creative. There's just this pool of ideas. A lot of stuff is being thrown at the whiteboard, and so that began, you know, a long journey into exploration and ministry and adventure. And it's interesting how God takes who you are, your DNA, and molds it to His own purpose. So He changes your character, but He pretty much leaves your personality intact because that's where the glory is. That's where the gift is. So in a short answer to a question, it's probably ADD, but I think God is sovereign even with that as well.
So you've always been crazy. It's just now you're channeling this, and you're climbing mountains. And so tell me, Grace Explorations. Give me the nutshell. What is that?
Yeah, so it's two of my favorite words that I just mashed together. I love grace. Grace is this effervescent word. I think Bono may be the only one that actually understands it when he writes about it and sings about it. It's this beautiful maiden, this girl that has this beautiful name that has the power to change the world. And so I've always been enamored with grace because I've traveled the world and I've studied world religions, and most world religions have a construct for justice, getting what you deserve. It's karma. They're really big on that because that's the way the world operates, essentially. And it makes sense. It's logical. You reap what you sow. Even the Bible talks about that a bit. And then there's another construct or another idea out there called mercy, which if justice makes us a rebel, then I think mercy can have the potential to make us into beggars. But grace is this unique phenomena that is unique to Christianity. Of all the world religions, we're the only ones that really have at least a grasp of what this idea is. And it's not just not getting what you deserve, which would be mercy. Getting what you deserve is justice. But this idea of being richly rewarded for something you could never earn has in its own DNA the ability to create true humility in the human heart. Mm-hmm. And I think that may be the rarest of all metals that heaven mines for in the human heart, because it's something you really can't conjure up out on your own because we're left by ourselves. We're individualists. We're prideful. We have a tremendous amount of hubris in our ego. Some world religions do better with the ego by deconstructing it, but a lot of what we do in religion is actually a construction or a building up the ego, and that's why we like to do good things, because it makes us feel better about ourselves, and then maybe in the off chance God might actually like us more. But grace dismantles all that. It's an atomic bomb. It has the ability to change people unlike anything. So I was always enamored with grace, and then the whole idea of explorations and the nobility that's infused in exploring, about discovering. And I know there isn't a lot of, terra incognita left. Everything is terra firma now. We seem to know what our geographic parameters are, but our whole moniker or motto with Grace Explorations is that the greatest journey is within. And so we've taken this whole external odyssey that people go on, oftentimes because they can't do the internal odyssey, which was the story of my life. I couldn't do 18 inches, so I had to go 18,000 miles, climb 18,000 feet, because I just couldn't get out of my head into my heart because of some trauma that had happened, layers of it actually, and I just couldn't get inside where the wellspring of life is, which is the heart. It's not the head. I think the only people that really figured that out of the ancient people were the Egyptians. They would always, when they went through their incredible embalming process, which was very exacting, and even to this day, people are amazed at how they were able to preserve these mummies for millennia. They always threw the brain away, but they kept the heart. They embalmed the heart. So there's something about the heart that eternity, we know that from Ecclesiastes, that eternity resides inside the human heart. There's a God particle, there's some DNA in there that just goes on and on and on into infinity. So I took those two words, put them together, and took all of my exploration background, which some people are interested in and some are not, and I'm just using that as a platform. And what I'm really trying to do is to flip the narrative, get them interested in looking for, when we looked for Noah's Ark, or when I was trying to climb the 7 continental summits, or skiing to the North Pole, which was part of what they call the Explorers Grand Slam. I've taken all that, and that's basically the front end of the story. But once they're attracted to that, or they're drawn to that, and I do a public speaking type of thing, then I flip the narrative and I basically just tell them, look, it's really not about that. Have respect for the journey. We have this thing in Western civilization, I call it destination disease, but we're always bent on getting to the destination. And when you look at other cultures, and even other religions for that matter, they have a lot more respect for the journey, because we also believe at Grace Explorations that the greatest discoveries in life are made while you're looking for something else. They're made along the journey. It's the breadcrumbs that you find along the way. It's not really even the destination, but the great discoveries are what you find, or who finds you, if you will, while you're looking for something else. And there's a tremendous amount of nobility in that. Proverbs 25 verse 2 talks about that the glory of God is the secret, but the glory of man, or in its original context, the glory of kings, is the search. And so I think what God does with mankind is he creates these searches, these enigmas, these encryptions, these set of mysteries in a person's life to motivate them or to propel them in a journey, because God knows the way the human journey processes itself, and it's inside the journey. And so he puts this secret in front of you. It could be a betrayal. It could be something you're ashamed of. It could be a wound. It could be a lie. It could be anything. He could even use your own ambitions to serve his own greater purposes. But he puts you on the search because he knows that in that search, his glory and his purposes will be accomplished. It's very clever that way. I couldn't write a script like that.
Wow.
It's amazing how that all plays out.
Well, I think you've just made these my two favorite words, too, now, grace and explorations. You mind if I borrow those? That's fantastic.
They're great words.
They are great words. So you have found that by propelling on a journey, there's a destination involved in it, and that destination, even though that isn't maybe ultimately the most important part of the journey, it does compel people to pay attention, to join you, to get out of their comfort zones. So you've done some exotic things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, tell me a little bit. Well, Finding Noah is the first one that comes to my mind. Tell me about that project.
Yeah. It was just one of those things where I saw something come out in 2009, and it was on the it was an Associated Press article. It was actually, I think, on my Yahoo News feed, and it shouldn't have been there because a Liberty University professor, Dr. Randall Price, who actually was the lead archaeologist for the group that found the first Dead Sea Scroll cave in the last 60 years. It's now designated as C12. I was actually with the group in January when they were able to discover a lot of anecdotal evidence that allowed them to scientifically confirm that the cave that we were looking in was actually indeed at one time a Dead Sea Scroll cave. All the evidence was there, the broken pottery, the goat skins, the papyrus fragments, and all those things, and the tools that were left behind. So he was basically just doing an interview with a Liberty University student that should have only stayed in the student newspaper. It went into the mainstream, and I just happened to see it on my newsfeed. I was like, that's interesting. At that point, I'd already climbed 5 of the 7 continental summits. I'd skied to the North Pole, and so I had some extreme conditioning and experience, and I knew that climbing to 17,000 feet and trying to excavate and drill into a 100-foot deep glacier, which is like concrete. It's not Michigan ice. It's not flaky. This is ice that's been around for millennia. It's compact snow, and it's hard as a rock, very dense, and it actually even has a different dielectric value on a ground-penetrating radar than new ice has. I knew they were getting in over their head. It was going to be like going to the moon. Most of the guys were from down south. So, they look at that mountain and say, man, that thing is just... It's white. What is that stuff? And I was looking up in the sky the other day, and this white stuff started coming down. I mean, they just had no context for this. So not only are we at 17,000 feet with 60% less oxygen in the air, guys fainting with chainsaws, and you've got these electrical storms that are like sticking your head into a beehive's nest, and you have geopolitical tension that exists there. You have an active terrorist group, the PKK, which is the militarized Kurdish group that's trying to get back their country that they lost after World War I. And then you have the Turkish army that's at the base of the mountain with a tank battalion that uses the mountain itself as a practice range, and also trying to kill Kurds at the same time. So you're in a place where, wow, Mother Nature's working against you. It feels like you're walking on. It almost feels like Middle Earth because you're walking on this mountain, and it feels like you're scaling the back of a dragon. It's moving. It's breathing. You get to the top of the mountain at 17,000 feet, and you can see the mustard tint on the rocks because it's volcanic, and so it's an extinct volcano, but it's breathing out sulfur, and so it has that smell of, man, something is breathing, it's alive, and then the rocks are falling at different parts of the day because the glaciers are melting or crevasses are opening and closing depending on which day. So this is a very dynamic environment, both geopolitically, geologically, spiritually. Everything is coming at you. Biblical storms, like half the time I always thought Charlton Heston was going to show up and crack the 10 Commandments over our head because nothing there was small. It was always biblical. The electrical activity, the wind. So, we got involved in that. I just told them, hey, look, I'm not a scientist, but I think I can keep you guys alive, or I can help you because I've been in extreme conditions before and I've been trained by the best. I'm not a professional guide. I'm not certified, but I've done some crazy stuff with the best that there is. And so eventually I ended up going with them. That was in 2009. 5 summers later, they made the film 2013. They actually filmed it in one summer season, 2013, which fortuitously or providentially was about the best year in probably the last half a century that they could have done that, because there was a ceasefire between the PKK and the Turks, and actually there was a lot of the PKK group that was fighting in Syria at that time. And so there was a relative calm on the mountain. They actually conducted a helicopter rescue. A guy had a compound fracture. I hadn't seen helicopters anywhere near the mountain for the 4 years preceding because they would have been shot out of the sky. So it was a great year to film. And they were there to tell the story of men who were looking for the Ark. And so as the story progressed and the producers just began to recognize that the real golden thread of this film is not about finding a boat. It's about the brotherhood that's searching for the boat. It's not about a discovery per se. It's about the search, because there's some ennoblement that happens in a man's heart when he goes on a search, on a quest. If you look at all the mythologies or the quests that men and women, for that matter, would go on, there was something ennobling about that, whether it was the Holy Grail or Noah's Ark or the Ark of the Covenant. There's something about going on a quest, going on an adventure, if you will, a little adventure, Bilbo Baggins leaving the Shire and going on this quest, and there's no guarantee of a return, and if you do return, you'll be changed. So that's really the only guarantee, is if you do return at all, you'll be a changed person. And you see that story over and over and over again. Joseph Campbell obviously really capitalized on that with the power of myth. I didn't agree with his conclusions, but he did understand that there's a powerful dynamic that happens in every myth that's ever been known to man, and it's always about the quest. It's about the heroic quest, about going out and discovering who you are, visiting the dark caves, the subterranean environments that your soul tends to flee from, and facing those. And as you face those and overcome them, you come back with a great, he used the word boon, a great reward. You have a great secret that you can share with humanity. And that's what we try to do with our men's ministries at Grace Explorations, is we try to get guys on a quest. And God has to initiate that.
Now, your quest, that makes a ton of sense to me, but you didn't climb Mount Olympus, in search of Greek mythological gods, right, which would have still been a journey and an adventure.
Sure.
You picked something which had more than just mythology behind it. You must have had some thought that we could conceivably find a remnant. I mean, what was your thought going into this?
Well, a lot of people ask me, do you really think that story is for real? And I was taken back to two of the gospel accounts. There's 4 gospel accounts, 4 records of Christ and what he taught and what he said, and I happen to believe that they got it right. And I like the fact that there are 4 because there's a tremendous amount of confidence. Anybody that's involved in the legal system will tell you that you need more than 1. You need 2 preferably, but if you have 3 or 4 accounts, you've got some really powerful testimonial accounts there. So I look at it as I just am not in a position to argue with Jesus Christ because when he spoke about the flood in 2 of the 4 Gospels, even though he was a master of metaphor, the prince of parables, if you will, he never treated the flood or the times of Noah or the catastrophe that followed the deluge and the dispersion of the people groups. He never talked about that in terms of metaphor. He treated it as actual historical fact. And so I always begin at that point, that if Christ taught it as fact, as historical fact, not as metaphor, which I think it has metaphoric and poetic applications for sure. Christ is the ark. We come into the ark through his wounds, through the side door. The light illuminates from above. The tears, flood the earth with God's broken heart from above and below. So there's tremendous poetic application there. But it's still at its core is a literal story. And what's fascinating is even someone like Robert Ballard, who is the greatest oceanographer of our age, of all ages for that matter. I mean, you discovered the Titanic, the Lusitania, Kennedy's PT-109 boat, the Bismarck, the Yorktown, I mean, you name it, just went on this hunch, and it was a theory that's been floating around for a couple of decades that the Ice Age melt occurred very rapidly in that particular part of the world, and as a result, the Mediterranean flooded itself, and the force of water created the Bosphorus as we know today through modern-day Istanbul, and burst into the Black Sea. And what we know about the Black Sea is that was a freshwater sea at one time, because when you get below, I'm not sure the exact depths, but 100, 150 feet, it's fresh. And so a lot of oceanographers are very curious about the Black Sea because it's like the Great Lakes. Once you get below that 100, 150-foot level, you're in freshwater. So they knew this was a freshwater sea. Something came in, the salt rises. So he went down there with his submersibles based on this theory that something must have happened here, because you can't have a story long before mass communication was ever developed and had that story basically be embedded in 500 different flood legends across the world, from the Aborigines to the Polynesians to the Chippewa Indian tribe in Michigan. How can you have one singular story be disseminated to such an extent that they have so many stories? And obviously they're contextualized. Some of them it's a big giant canoe or a bowl or a balsam raft, whatever, but it's all at the core the same thing. There's a flood, there's a massive catastrophe, there's a certain remnant that's saved, and civilization is rebirthed. And so he went on that theory that something must have happened here to make an indelible tattoo on the human consciousness. And so he brought his submersibles there, and lo and behold, and this was actually on ABC, Back to the Beginnings. It came out a couple years ago. Fascinating deal. They went back to all these biblical stories, kind of like what Morgan Freeman did with the character of God here recently on National Geographic. And so they went back, and what did he find? Well, he found ancient shorelines, which is not terribly unusual because they're obviously things flood or recede. I mean, we know that just from the geological footprint. But what he found unusual was not that there was just ancient shorelines, but that it appeared that the people left everything in a sudden hurry and left everything as is. It was almost like a snapshot of time. And it was fascinating to him because he's like, something must have happened here, because everything was left as is. The carts, the houses. I mean, this was not a gradual occurrence. Something big happened very quickly to a catastrophic extent that it tattooed the mind of human consciousness. And so he, essentially that's his description of the biblical narrative. I don't agree with his summations or his conclusions, but it is fascinating that a guy like Robert Ballard, who's not a believer, would come to some type of conclusion that, you know what, the story at its core, there's got to be some truth here. And I think most anthropologists recognize it as well. It's a meta-narrative. It's one of these overarching stories. And then you have psychologists like Freud and Jung, who basically felt that it was an interpretation of our own birthing experience into the world, that it's some type of meta-consciousness, or this collective memory is the word I want to use for this, where it's something that's actually embedded in you in infancy. You break the water breaks from the womb and you come into the world. And so they felt like in many ways this was a metaphor And that's why we're just enamored with the flood, because it's one of these stories that feels like life, it feels like rebirth, it feels like resurrection, and everything in us craves for that. We don't like it because it looks like death, but on the other side, God's ultimate redemption is not resuscitation or reconciliation, although those are part of it. His ultimate redemption is resurrection, and the best way that he can do that is for you to die, both in this life and in the next life to come, so that he can do what? Resurrect you. It's the whole idea behind Easter. It's that eucatastrophe that Tolkien coined, this idea of a sudden glorious moment that was unexpected or unlooked for happens, and it just takes your breath away. It's astounding. It was unlooked for, incomprehensible. And so I think in many ways I came to the Ark story because it is a big story, and it is a unifying story. The Quran, the Torah, all these things are saying essentially the same thing, so it actually has the ability to unite people. And so we had a lot of different faiths involved in this story. Our reporters were Muslims, they were Kurdish, they're friends of me to this day, mostly on Facebook, but they're good guys. When you shed blood, sweat, and tears and risk life and limb for 5 years, the religion thing is not at the forefront. It's about just staying alive. So those other sub-narratives are not as big of an issue, but it is a big story, and we thought that, wow, if we could find this thing. In the trailer, there's a guy that talks about that. He says, if you find this thing, it changes all the ologies. It changes everything from anthropology and archaeology to zoology. You have to rewrite so many textbooks. It'll make a lot of people upset. So it's a big, big story, because now you have found a lost link to a lost civilization. And I talk about that emblematically, that the Ark is really an emblem. We wanted to find this ship, because what would this ship tell us? I mean, we could learn about its technology. We could learn about the wood. We could learn about a lot of things, because it would be the last remnant to a lost civilization, the antediluvian time frame. And I try to tell people that that's emblematic of the human heart. When you get your heart back, frozen in ice, on your own lonely mountain of pain, if you will, drawing on Middle-earth metaphors, if you can get back to your heart, if you can get your heart back, you get your life back. You get that link back to the first 3 chapters of Genesis. We spend so much time talking about all the shame that came after Genesis chapter 3. But what we try to do with Grace Exploration is we try not to police original sin. We try to pursue original glory. I want to go after a man's nobility. He already knows what he's doing wrong. I don't even need to say anything. I don't have to go after. He's already beating himself up and feels disconnected from God over that. But if I can remind him that that's not what's the most true about you. It's not that you're not a sinner, you are, and there's a need for grace and redemption and confession. That's what the cross is all about. But when you really stumble into your identity in Christ, you begin to realize that, wow, there's a lot of powerful things going on in here. We are carriers of the image of Christ. We are image bearers of Christ. We are reflections of his greater glory to a world that's gone dark. So I try to get guys back to that first 3 chapters of what would it have been like to wake up every day and not have any communication problem between you and your wife. You and Eve are totally communicating. You are naked in the truest sense of the word. It doesn't have to be connected to just a physicality or the physicalness of being naked. It's actually more about being true. You have nothing to hide.
Nothing hidden.
Yeah, there's clothes is just, that's an immaterial thing. Nothing is hidden. It's all there. Yeah, no secrets. You're transparent, almost translucent for that matter. You get along with your kids. For most guys, can you imagine a time frame in your life where you actually enjoy what you're doing? I mean, Adam woke up every day, if he woke up at all, and was excited about what he was doing. He was working every day. He was naming animals. He was taking care of this beautiful garden. He loved what he did. He had a great relationship with his wife. The children obviously came, in the narrative. And then most importantly of all, there was no shame barrier between man and God. So man hadn't created God in his own shameful image yet. John Lynch, a great writer, wrote The Cure and a couple of other things. It always talks about this idea that there's 2 gods. There's a God that our shame creates and that we hide from and that we try to do good things to get on his good side. And then there's God who still is and always has been and always will be. And he's still in the garden, waiting under the tree, if you will, where your initials and his initials are carved together. And he's still waiting there, and he's not changed at all. Your shame has changed him. You've created a God in your own image. You've made an idol out of your own shame. And what I think God is trying to bring us back to is this whole idea of story, which is what you do so well. Telling stories. It's the quickest, closest link between the truth and the human heart is to tell a story. I mean, God tried to tell us that when he put his son here on earth, and all he did was he told stories. Sermons tell, stories touch. He just kept telling story after story after story. So I tell all of our guys that come to our meeting at base camp that speak, I just tell them, tell the story, tell your story, because people can't argue with that. It is what it is. And if you tell it well, and if you shed enough light in that story, it'll have the power of a sermon without preaching a sermon. And people will be changed because the story has the ability to connect with our feelings, with the deepest, truest part of us.
You said earlier that, just looking at mercy, when we were talking about grace explorations, that just looking at mercy, it can turn us into beggars. But we don't beg for God's grace because it's born out of love.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're touching on. It's not that the shame is where we live and God has to just kind of forgive this shamefulness out of some sense of obligation. Grace is a big step beyond that.
Absolutely. It's disarming. It's explosive. It does nothing to feed your ego because you can't do anything to make it happen. It's just this biggest, best, and brightest idea that God created through the cross. It was initiated, if you kind of Tolkien, I think, got this. He had this whole idea of a king, right? And these kings of Gondor and these other kingdoms would come and go, and at times the line of kings would wane to the extent that there were no more kings. And then you have this Aragorn figure that's growing up in obscurity, almost like Christ, on the backside of the desert for 30 years, and then he comes into his own and becomes a king, even though he was a king long before that. But it's this idea that the steward has to reign in the place of the king. And so I think when I look at his writings poetically, to me, it's a beautiful thing. I think grace is the steward of the kingdom. I think when Christ died physically on the cross and was resurrected physically from the cross and went into heaven to become all that he is, interceding for us at the right hand of God as God's son, I think that now we are in an era of grace. We are in the stewardship of grace, and when the king returns, there'll be an exchange again, but it's almost as if a steward, a Denethor or an Ecthelion, for those of you that are Middle-earth nerds out there, you know what I'm talking about. He's come in, or she, if you will. I like it as a she because I think that works really well, especially with what Solomon did with wisdom in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. But it's this idea that grace is now, she's prominent. It's almost like Victor Hugo said, that you can't stop an idea whose time has come. And I think that's the idea that God has. If there's one big, bold, bright idea that heaven has brought to earth, it has to be grace, because it's the only thing that can really change us.
Well, the No Shame podcast today is with Kevin DeVries, and we are getting Victor Hugo, Robert Ballard, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. There are quotes all over the Grace Exploration websites, and now I see where they come from. And I love how you have seen truth in all these great minds and great writers. But you said something a minute ago that Jesus himself used story more than preaching. Story touches, preaching teaches. You have to have lived a little bit of life, even if it's an inward life, but you have to have lived in order to see and to tell a story. So Grace Explorations, tell me a story from Noah's adventure, that when you're finding Noah and there's got to be 1,000 of them, but take me along on one.
Yeah, well, it all came together to me in 2013. So I think I'm almost 50. So I'm hitting that golden era now. I'm 49, same age as Daniel Craig, who's the current James Bond, at least at the moment. So I don't feel old yet. Until they retire him, then I will feel old. He's still, he's still got the car and the gal and all that good stuff. But it was 2013. I just got to this point where I was collecting dots, collecting, but nothing was connecting. And finally in 2013, the epiphanies came. And I began to realize that, you know what, maybe at this point in time, I'm not meant to find the arc of history. Maybe what's really happening here is I'm meant to find the arc of my story. And part of that, the mechanism for making it happen is this quest to Noah's Ark and to look for it. But what became very powerful to me was the actual name of the mountain that we were climbing. And I can't believe I missed this for 4 seasons in a row, but I think I wasn't ready to actually see it. You see what you want to see, and until you're healed, you don't see it correctly. The mountain we were climbing is called Agrida, which in the Turkish language is the painful mountain. And I felt like what God was revealing to me in that final season as the guys were filming Finding Noah, I felt that he made it very painfully clear to me that with each season, with each year, with each foot that we were climbing, drilling, and excavating into the ark, into the ice, looking for the ark, I felt like what he was saying to me was, this is emblematic of your heart. Your heart is like an ark. It's buried in ice. It's full of shame, and shame numbs you, so you become like a leper, and you lose the gift of feeling. You become robotic. You actually become like a religious robot. Pharisees are essentially that. They're religious robots. They don't feel anymore because their whole world is graceless. They're all about justice and occasional mercy, but there's nothing graceful in their life. And so it feels like you're a leper, really. You just subconsciously walk into rooms and you try to connect with people, but you're saying subconsciously, unclean, unclean. If you really knew who I was, you wouldn't want to be around me. And it's this imaginary world that you live in, and you're a leper and you're unfeeling. I mean, parts of you are falling off. And the greatest gift that Christ gave the lepers was not only healing and a cure, but he gave them the gift of feeling again. So I tell people, I felt like that year on the mountain, it was like, wow, we're drilling into this ice. And I felt like God was just saying to me, I'm trying to give you your heart back. I'm trying to create a scenario where you can find your heart again, frozen in trauma, leprous, unfeeling, detached, void of any emotional connection. And it was actually the guys on the mountain that year that really precipitated that type of dialogue that I had with the divine. They all were special ops guys. Every year we had a Navy SEAL or an Army Ranger or airborne, and these guys were there to keep us safe because their skill set was helping people exit the planet or keeping people that wanted to stay on the planet. And they were the ones that first diagnosed me. They're like, man, dude, you got what we got. And I was just, well, what's that? arc fever? And they said, no, you got post-traumatic stress disorder. I was like, well, that's interesting. I says, keep talking. You've got my ear, because something about that sounds true. And I said, well, how do you know? And they said, well, we look in your eyes and you get that 2,000-yard stare. The lights are on, but nobody's home. And then we hear you talk, and this is what really got my attention. When you talk, you can tell these guys have been through their own therapeutic journey. When you talk, you're always talking about something way ahead in the future, what you're going to do, mountains, business stuff, whatever, or you're beating yourself up over your past. So you're afraid of your future in a certain way, and you're punishing your past, but you're never here. You're never right now. You're never now, if you will. And that's an incredible sign or clue to trauma, is it always takes you out of the now. And so people take their life because they can't get back into their movie as their own life. They're watching everybody else do their life. They can't connect with their kids. These guys that are coming back from war. I mean, everybody dies on the battlefield. It's just that some guys actually physically come home. There's something inside the human conscience that's raped, that's pillaged, that's destroyed on battlefields, whether it's domestic or foreign. Rape victims will tell you this. Physical abuse. I mean, there's so many layers to this thing. Kids growing up in inner cities, my goodness, they're hearing gunshots and seeing all kinds of conflict, crazy stuff happening all the time. So trauma is a big, big deal that we go after. And we go after it with grace, because grace is ageless and it's timeless, as is trauma. Trauma is timeless. You can have a memory in your life that's frozen, almost like the Wicked White Witch of Narnia coming into your life. And Lewis got this, just like Tolkien did, because you have two individuals, both of them are orphans for the most part. Lewis, his dad, was still alive throughout his teenage years, but he was estranged after his mom died at an early age. Tolkien lost his dad when I think he was 3 and his mom when he was 12. And so all their characters are orphans. They're going through these mythic landscapes that feel so true, you almost want to enter into them, because they're tapping into, I would say it this way, they're colonizing our dreams. They're raiding the mythological refrigerator, and they're speaking a language that speaks so deep, you actually believe this secondary universe is real, because what's happening, it feels real. So the Narnia witch feels like trauma, and she comes into your life and she freeze frames these moments, the day the dragon came, or the day your mom and dad broke up, or the day somebody touched you or did something to you that was so shameful, you're going to die with that secret. Mm-hmm. And so that part of you never gets touched. It remains immobile, afraid, frozen, detached, animated as a freeze frame in a movie, if you will. And the only thing that can break that is Aslan, which again has a tremendous personal connection for me, because that's a Turkish word for lion. And so Lewis is this guy who went through World War II, just like Tolkien. Tolkien was in a regiment of 900 some odd soldiers by, I don't know, a year and a half into the war. He survived the Battle of Somme, 25,000 guys killed in the first day, million plus casualties on both sides. One of the most horrific battles of all time, and perhaps the most horrific war of all time. So Tolkien survives that. There's I think there was maybe 15 or 16 guys left after a year and a half in his regiment, so they disbanded it. So the only thing that saved him was trench fever. He's got trauma as an orphan, as a World War I vet. Lewis is in an artillery unit as a young man, and a shell comes in and obliterates the guy next to him into red mist. All of this stuff gets all over him. He gets shrapnel, and he gets sent back home. So you have two individuals here that have a very acute awareness of what trauma looks like, and it comes out in their writings. It's probably subconscious. I don't even think they realize what they're doing. But I think for Lewis, I think he understood that this Lion of Judah, it's perfect because a lion can be noble and savage, tender and tough, fair and fierce, all at the same time. It can be dangerously good. And so he's got this construct for this lion. And the only thing that can break the power of trauma or the winter that never ends is the roar of the lion. And so I like to say it this way, that it's always winter, never spring, until you hear the roar of the king, until Christ comes in and breaks the power of this long winter of discontent. I'm throwing all kinds of stuff in here, Shakespeare, but there's this idea that something can break. And then I think Tolkien went even deeper, and now all of a sudden you can see these dwarves and their former stunted images of taller, greater selves. And they're wandering the wastelands of Erebor in the form of, Thorin Oakenshield and his wandering dwarves, and in comes this hobbit, and there's one transcendent scene in the first of the Hobbit trilogy which really, really resonated with me. They come out of the Goblin Cave, and there's a big conflict over whether they should go back and look for Bilbo, who somehow was left behind. And so Gandalf wants to go back in, the dwarves don't, because they need to get on the run, because the goblins are going to come out as soon as it's dark, and it's going to be all kinds of mayhem, as Gandalf said, out of the fire into the frying pan. And what was so powerful in that scene, as the magic ring comes off and Bilbo becomes himself again, which another emblem of trauma. Trauma makes you feel invisible. He takes the ring off. He becomes visible, becomes known, takes his mask off, if you will. And they ask him, why did you come back? And he says to them, as only Martin Freeman could, he says, you guys, you don't have a home. I have a home. I can go back and have my 6 meals a day and my handkerchiefs and all my snacks and all. I didn't ask for this adventure. I'm a burglar. I know I don't look the part. I'm not a burglar. I'm more like a grocer. So I know I'm out of place. But you know what? I'm here. I'm paraphrasing. I'm here because I want to help you find home. And so when people say, what do you do? I says, I'm basically a 6'3" hobbit that's trying to get the dwarves back to Erebor to kill the dragon, or if you're in the Eastern context, tame the dragon or ride the dragon. Like we've seen in some of the popular animation films that have come out, is this whole idea of harnessing your fears, and instead of killing it, taming it and harnessing it and using it for a positive end. But there's something about conquering that dragon, whether you kill it or conquer it or whatever. Something has to happen where you can get back into the mountain, you can get your gold back, you can get the harps off the wall. As they were talked about, in the book of Psalms, that when the Jewish people came back out of exile for a long period of time, the harps were always hung on the poplars, and they lamented that. In fact, there was this long lamentation of, where's the music? Where's the mirth? And Tolkien embedded that in his whole dwarvish mythology, and this whole idea that on the walls are the harps, right? And they're full of dust, and they've never been played again. But when they get back Erebor, the harps are taken off the wall, the music, the mirth, the merriment all returns because the dragon is dead. They've come back, and even, I think it's just brilliant to me. I'm seeing this through God goggles, but I look at the Lonely Mountain. I think Tolkien was trying to describe the heart of every man. It's lonely, it's friendless, it's without color, it's functionatory, but it's full of fear, and this dragon of fear and trauma sitting on top of your gold. So I try to get men to remember their forgotten gold. I try to remember, I try to bring them back to the day of the dragon, when the pines were roaring and the bells in the dale, were ringing, and all these different conjurings, these ideas and these symbols and these sounds. I try to bring them back. What was that like, when the fire came, when the dragon came? And guys are like, I don't want to go back to that day when the Cub Scout leader did this, that, and the other thing. I don't want to go back to that day when mom and dad said they're going to forget about loving each other. I don't want to. But I tell them, look, I have to take you back to that day. I'm not a therapist. I've just kind of done some stuff. I've been to the halls of the paths of the dead, if you will. I mean, I've gone to the bottom. I've been through 2 marriages. I'm twice divorced. I've been through bankruptcy. I was a $1 million net worth guy. I've gone from here to here. It's a very dramatic narrative arch. I've been through the bowels of the underworld and wanted to end my own life. I've been through that, and I think I have a message for you, and I'm trying to tell you that your pain, or your purpose rather, is encrypted inside your pain. There's something about pain. The enemy understands this dynamic that if he can keep you in a place of pain, you'll never discover your purpose, because your purpose is actually embedded or encrypted inside your pain. Robert Bly always talked about that. One of my favorite poets talked about this idea that a man's genius is inside his wound. And there's something really powerful about that. So if I can get a man back into his pain, back to the dragon, back to Erebor, getting the gold back, getting the Arkenstone back, the heart of the mountain, the place where his wealth will come back, the place where favor will come back, almost Job-like in its dimensions, where people are giving him golden rings and the gold is coming back and everything is coming back 2 times what it was, more children, more lineage, more descendants, love, all this stuff comes back. I've got to get him back to the dragon first. And it was so powerful to me to be on that mountain and to realize that, wow, this is not about the arc of history for me. It'll be found what it needs to be found. My faith doesn't rely on it. It just had tremendous scientific and academic and spiritual implications if it was found. But maybe the real nugget was to find the arc of my story. And I had been running for so long. My story had owned me for literally 15, probably 17 years. I was in exile. My story is crazy. It's all on my website with a ton of YouTube stuff. But essentially my trauma, or part of my trauma, happened while I was preaching about Noah's Ark on February 22nd, 1998, and watched my marriage explode in the service. It takes too long to tell that whole story, but the enemy knew exactly what he was doing in that moment, and he did it in such a way that he made sure that my wound occurred inside my calling. He wants to keep me out of the platform of speaking, whatever that is, a movie or base camp at Founders. He wanted to keep me away from that because he knew diabolically that if he could keep me outside of speaking to people, I would never fulfill the reason why I was born. So why not do that while the guy's preaching? It was genius. People are like, I don't believe in the devil. I was like, well, let me tell you what happened on February 22nd. Clever. This is how the enemy works. He hits you low. It's vicious. It's deliberate. It's diabolical. But the beautiful part is that God is so sovereign. He even takes that moment and makes a bigger story of it. In fact, you actually get to the point at the end of your story where you can get to the Genesis 45 thing, and you can be in front of your brothers like Joseph was. I mean, Joseph had the ability to interpret everybody's dream but his own. He's in front of his brothers. They've come now to Egypt. The whole world is in mass starvation. He's the guy. They don't recognize him. He probably looks like the Newsboys with his mascara and, the shaved head. He's got the whole Newsboys look, so they don't know who he is. Like, who is this guy? But he says something incredibly powerful. This is a moment of grace. It's beyond mercy. It's beyond justice. It's just way beyond anything we can even conceptualize. But he has this epiphany in Genesis 45. They're bowing down to him. And I think he just has a moment like, I've seen this before. This is deja vu. This is, where did I see this before? And then it comes back to him after those long decades, 12 or 13 years in prison, which became the passage to his palace. He's looking at his brothers and he's seeing this happening. He's like, bingo. I've seen this before. And then he begins to understand. I think it must have hit him like a mountain falling into the sea. I think he realized in that moment, if my brothers hadn't done what they did to me, I never would have been in the right time, in the right place, with the right people to save the world from literal starvation. And so he said to his brothers something that is incredibly powerful, especially as it relates to brokenness and trauma and people hurting you, or you hurting yourself, or thinking God hurt you and he betrayed you. It's a very powerful statement. He says to his brothers, you did not send me to Egypt. Dramatic pause. God did. So he gives his brothers grace. He realized that they had a part to play, and that if it wasn't for them, he never would have been in that right place at the right time with the right people. So ultimately, that's what redemption looks like. So now you can go back to the people that hurt you and actually thank them. Not condescending or gratuitous, but integral. Thanks.
Switchfoot has a new song, The Wounds Are Where the Light Shines Through.
Yeah.
And it picks up on this. And, there you are back to Egypt. and your idea that the heart encased in ice, 400 years after Joseph, we're going to find Pharaoh, and God's going to harden, not his brain.
Yeah.
He didn't confuse his mind. He hardens his heart.
I never thought of it that way.
Hardens his heart. He's got no feeling left. And you've probably had a chance, if you're listening to this podcast and you want to download it, save it. Your required reading now so that you can listen to this podcast again includes Robert Bly, Genesis, Psalms, The Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, How to Tame Your Dragon. Get yourself up to speed here so you can hang with Kevin DeVries.
You asked me, it's ADD, I'm all over the map.
Man, but seriously, you bring those great works to life. And, Kevin, it's just, if I don't know where the podcasts go or where they might get played, but I sure hope and pray that our conversation here starts to melt the ice for somebody's heart. And if they want to log into you a little bit more, if they're in the West Michigan area, they can come to your Grace Explorations nights at Founders. Or
Yep.
how else can people say, I want to hear more from Kevin, and I think you could help me? How would they do that?
Yeah, well, go to graceexplorations.com. It's plural with an S, and that's where everything lives. We have trips to Israel, you can go all the way around the world with us if you want. In September, it's a men's retreat. That's there as well. Or if you're in the West Michigan area, we have this thing called Base Camp, which essentially is the place where we call it the place of stories for men. And we also call it a place where we brew what men thirst, which is an authentic life. So it's not about necessarily what's coming out of the tap as much as it is what we're telling in a story format. And so we tell stories there. We don't preach sermons. There's nothing wrong with sermons, but we want to do something a little bit different in this format and complement the church. Actually, there's a lot of churches that are involved with what we're doing because they see it as a viable tool in their box to reach people that otherwise wouldn't even come to their building. So that's our big thing, and that's always the second, starting August 13th. They can go to graceexplorations.com and click on the Base Camp link, and they can make a reservation there through Eventbrite. It is limited seating capacity. We've been sold out since we started in March. It's once a month. We've now moved from the first Sunday night of every month to the second Sunday night of every month, starting August 13th through December, and then we'll take a look and figure out where we're going to go from there. But those are some practical things. If you're a guy out there and you're wanting to do life with a group of men, if you click on the Band of Brothers icon on our webpage, there's all kinds of groups all over West Michigan of guys that are doing life together, like Jesus did with the 12 disciples. I don't know, somehow we've lost this. We've complicated it. It's really simple. It's you and Jesus and a squad of guys, 8 or 10 or 12 guys, doing life, sharing life, telling stories. And if you want to memorize scripture together, you can do that. Or if you want to do a Bible study, curriculum, whatever. But whatever you do, you got to get into each other's stories, because one of the things that we've noticed about Base Camp that's so powerful, and it's what you do through the medium of film and other platforms, is sin and shame die when stories are told in safe places. There's something magnetic, there's something combustible about telling your story to another human being, and they in turn recognizing your humanity and telling you you're okay, you still love them. So we do really well with this vertical thing. We have priests and we have pastors and we have Jesus Christ that we confess our sins to, and we go into these confessional booths and we do this exchange. And so, yeah, we're doing okay vertically for the most part, at least we like to think we are. But where we don't do as well is the horizontal. How does this thing look? And so we try to tell people sin is forgiven by Christ, but shame is healed in community, in the sharing and telling of stories. And I would say this based on my own personal experience, I don't think my shame could have been touched or healed if I just kept this vertical connection with God. I think that God created life and humanity and Christianity. I mean, good grief, it's a cross. It's horizontal and vertical. I think what he was trying to say is you have to do life with people. You have to do community with people. You have to tell your story to people. You have to allow people to tell you you're okay.
Yep.
I still like you.
Yep.
And I see the image of Christ in you, regardless of what you think about yourself.
He who has been forgiven much loves much.
There it is.
And he who has been forgiven little loves little.
Yeah.
May we be big, big lovers, because we have been forgiven much.
We have.
And even from our brothers, it doesn't have to just be vertical. You are fascinating. I'll just say, anyone who's listening, this is my first chance to get to know Kevin DeVries, and I sure hope it's not my last, because I am just enamored with your passion and your intellect and your pursuit of God and your unfolding of the Scriptures just in this podcast. So just thank you, my brother, for coming in tonight. What a beautiful story you have to tell. And please follow up with Grace Explorations. If you've listened to this podcast, you are as intrigued as I am. So go to Israel with Kevin, or go to the brewery, or climb 2 of those 7 mountains that you haven't climbed yet, if there's still a couple left, apparently.
Well, we're hoping to hit Everest Base Camp in the next year or 2.
Oh, you are nuts. Okay, so my new crazy friend, Kevin DeVries, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much.
Have no shame.